on this very short lunch break, but we have a very, very tight schedule, so we have to go on. I have the pleasure to introduce Mohren and Herbordt, who will talk about the catalogue of performative action #1. They're graduates of the Institut für angewandte Theaterwissenschaften in Gießen. Together they realized since 2000 interdisciplinary projects in the border area of performing arts. Herbert Mohren, that's what they call themselves, have been fellows of the Akademie Schloss Solitude in Stuttgart. Since 2011, they are artist members of the Young Academy of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, as well as the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. Since 2012, Herbert Mohren worked in different formats and media about institutions, as well as their actualizations, and are engaged in an institutional critique in the performing arts. And that's why they're here as well. So I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Lotte, and thank you to Iris and Marcell for the kind invitation. Okay, so yeah, if we are not understandable, please just let us know via science or anything else. Already. And also I have to excuse, we wrote it mainly down not to get lost in the English language, so I hope you can still follow and it will not be too boring. Anyhow, so in the beginning of this year we were invited to examine the so-called Spinnerakten, which are called in English something like nutcase or weirdo files, at the archive of the Max Planck Society in Berlin. It's a collection of mainly submissions that were made to the Max Planck Society with proposals for new research institutes or for new research focuses. Collected from 1948 on, which was the year of funding of the Max Planck Society, they were collected in folders first labeled as miscellaneous, and then later from 1961 on they were called weirdo. Another group of documents we were reviewing were files starting from 1911 on of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, which was the forerunner society of the Max Planck Society, and again with suggestions for institutions that again were never realized. We were interested in those files as Lotte already mentioned, as our previous works were performative setups dealing with archiving, especially a series of works called Alles, was ich habe, All That I Have, and as well as with institutions, which was called Die Institution. And as such, both of those works were starting points for a catalogue of performative practices, in which, through artistic proposals, we try to understand, to question and to expand seemingly established terms, conditions and concepts, for example, archive or institutions, amongst others. So in the following, we'd like to introduce you to some of those files of unrealized institutes of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft and the Max Planck Society, and we'd also like to shortly present both of those projects I was just mentioning. The Max Planck Society for the Advancement of Science is, in its own words, Germany's most successful research organization. It has a focus on basic research in natural, life and social sciences, as well as in the humanities, and it consists of 83 institutes. The Max Planck Society was founded in 1948, and that year it took over the institutions and functions of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, the Kaiser Wilhelm Society for the Advancement of Science, which was founded in 1911. And the archive of the Max Planck Society, which you see in the middle picture, was established in the 70s to collect and to safeguard the files of both societies. So it mainly contains materials from discontinued institutes or from finished institutes or finished research groups and their researchers. The archive for example, includes the history of 18 Nobel laureates, contains file of the involvement of the institutes in the 2 world wars, whereas the involvement with the Nazi regime was only critically reviewed in the late 90s. The archive contains the files that led to the discovery of the nuclear fission in its Institute of Chemistry in 1938, and as well as inheritances of the directors as Albert Einstein, Otto Hahn, Max Planck, Werner Heisenberg, and others. So this is just to give you a bit of a frame of what kind of archive we are talking of and where those files Bernhard is now going to present are situated.
Because within that huge and traditional and impressive and very successful research institution, they collected for those last 100 years also unrealized plans, as Melanie said, for research institutes called the Virdok files. And examples of those files, which we were happy to go through for 1 month, it's much more than you see in that image, and it's plans for research institutes, for example, like an archive of labor from 1917, or a universal archive for law and political science from 1912, or an institute of mind statistics and knowledge expansion from 1911, an institute for the circulation of scientific knowledge from 1928, or a journal for world knowledge from 1912. So as you could easily recognize only in the titles, one noticeable link in many of those proposals, especially in the beginning of the last century, is the claim for some universal relevance or universalism, or just to cover every possible knowledge in one specific field. So the project's ambitions cover, as I just said, not less, and now I read some quotations out of that files. They cover not less than a catalogue of all remarkable research findings and ideas in all areas of science, especially if the author doesn't have the means for appropriate publication. The intention is a consistent and complete work to represent the most heterogeneous elements in a harmonic composition, as stated in the Institute of Mind Statistics and Knowledge Expansion. Or they claim to install or to initiate an archive of labor, to establish a collection of all potential knowledge about all particular professions, and to bridge the gaps of our knowledge about the life of the working classes, as it's easy to recognize in the archive of labor. Or, as a last quote, the Journal for World Knowledge claims to uncover all lacks and faults, migrating since centuries through the history of the natural sciences and leading all the applications in technology and life to a dead end. So the universal claim of the relevance is quite easy to recognize in those examples from the beginning of the last century. But as the century proceeds, this will to universalism, which could be perceived as quite a serious approach in that time, is getting more and more absolute, or sometimes even manic, and leads at one point to submissions, especially in the middle of the last century, which ask institutional support for, and this is the German scan of one letter arriving at the Max Planck Society from a private institute for causality. So there's one guy in Langen, which is a very small village, and there's one guy who claims to be the founding director and only employee of the private institute for causality. He's 82, and he claims that he needs financial and institutional support by the Max Planck Society for that simple marathon to to the ultimate goal of universalism, integrity and vitality, for being able to finally solve all questions of law and effect in one formula. Or others want to gain just a permanent world peace, achieved by universal power, holding the exclusive right for the usage of nuclear weapons, and therefore become the judge of the world. So this is also in the middle of the last century, of course, when the Cold War started and the nuclear weapons were more easy to hand and so on. Or, and the last example, that others do in general want to induce the universal salvation of mankind through a new world order against inhumanity. And what sounds in those short quotations also a little bit funny is always accompanied by long descriptions of how that could be actually reached. So that in total, and all those proposals were rejected. And in total, all those letters could easily represent a parallel history of the political not wanted, as for example in the case of the Archive of Labor in 1917, where the politics were simply not interested enough in the life and organization of the working classes to finance that huge, extensive goal. So it's on the one hand there are those parallel histories of the political not wanted, and on the other hand there are also cases which could be easily represent a parallel history of paranoid schizophrenia. So the edge between one and the other is quite thin. For example, in this letter, it's also just to see the handwriting, and I will translate a very short part of it. In this letter, in 1953, a woman is describing the voices she was hearing in the very moment when Stalin died. And she describes herself as a medium, and she offers her special qualifications in that way of hearing things others can't hear, to the Institute for Physics, so that maybe they can be in use for them. So the letters of rejection do therefore, because of all those very different motivations and qualities of submissions, range from either pre-printed forms or are referring to various causes of rejection, like the lack of time, the president is traveling and can't read your proposal, or economic reasons, the means of the society are already subjected to existing institutes, or the practicability. The task is way too expensive for our research society. Or, as I already said, the political context. For example, they wrote, "The times are not right for an undertaking like this. We might get back to you when the war will have come to an end." Or, at least in unofficial and internal writing, one other reason for rejection is also the mental health of the applicant. The quotation is it's an internal correspondence. Enclosed, we return the so-called memorandum. You actually really don't need to read it. The author is one of those people who bother us from time to time with quite incomprehensible submissions. Or another quotation, "The world-saving fantasies of the mentally ill are sufficiently known." So whether the author of this submission is suffering from paranoid schizophrenia must be clarified by a psychiatric checkup. And finally, the shortest and also most defeating classification can be found in one single word mostly on the top of the letter, which is written here. Spinne means weirdo, exclamation mark. And that was the sign for the secretary to put that letter to those files we just read a few months before.
But what in general was quite interesting to see is that, because now it sounds very funny and also it's like very fast decisions. And what was kind of exciting to see was that they really took time to study the proposals. So if like one would propose the proposal to the director of the society, and then the director would read it, he would give it to someone who is in charge, it is not part of his knowledge. So it's not that they were like fast decisions, and what one could also think. I found that quite interesting, because it's really lots of proposals they got during all those times, and most of them really got considered and discussed quite extensively. And it's interesting to see how those correspondences work between the different institutes and directors and stuff like that. So besides the reasons Bernhard was just mentioning not to institute, there were maybe two others more I just like briefly to add. There's one starting on from the late Weimar Republic, that of course the number of marginalized and mostly Jewish researchers increased, and then their proposals again were rejected for political reasons. And the other one is that proposals were just ahead of their time. For instance, we came across one proposal for reform pedagogy, and which was from 1911, which was the year when the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft was just founded. And so the proposal for reform pedagogy came at a time when the society itself was just funding the first two institutes, which was for chemistry and the other was physical chemistry. So they were not yet ready for officially institute progressive education. So maybe one could say that those unrealized institutes function as drafts for another possible history, or rather future, of science and society. And as underlying question remains, what would have happened if those institutes would have been realized, or if at least they had become more public as they are now? We were, in most of the cases, the second users of those files. So they are in the archive, meaning almost public since, public, it's a little tricky to get in, but one can get in. They are public since 1975, and so in most cases we were the second users. There are lots of folders. We were the first ones to put our name and review them. Yes, this was maybe to just wrap up the files of the Max Planck Society. So I briefly talk a bit from our background in approach dealing with archiving, which was called Alles was ich habe, All That I Have. And it started as a collection of squared archive papers, which you see there. It's several thousand, so there's only a few of them. And each of these documents refers to one out of 170 questions. Just to give you an impression, the first one is who speaks, and the last question is are we alone, if I'm right. So in those questions, they function as the first structural element for this entirely analog archive. So you can, I don't know if it's, no, one cannot really see it, but you see, so everything that goes into the archive, or actually one needs rather to say in our collection, gets this label, and there's the number, there is the title, there is the contributor, there is the date and place of its origin, or when it got registered into the archive. Based on those documents, we invented narrations, protagonists, sounds, interviews, objects that cannot be seen, movements, and so on. We listed them in inventory lists. We created films, objects, books, choreographies, text, audio guides, etc., etc. And again, related everything and every single item to one of the 170 questions, or to more of those questions. So here, this was, actually it was here, there was, I don't know how many meters of inventory lists, and one would be with possible protagonists, the other one would be with stories that could have been told, the other one with sounds that could have been heard, and all of it in alphabetical order, with a little question number as a reference to navigate through the material. So we multiplied the given information in a seemingly endless net of invented references and correlations. This, for instance, is a list of, this was the list of small objects, as one can see. And as a visitor, one can follow through those traces we give with the questions, or you could create new ones, or you can simply decide to get lost. So these are just images of different setups of how we present the material, and you can see that the elements more or less are the same, but are presented in a different manner. Sometimes it's with performers, sometimes it's without performers, sometimes it has a thematic focus, sometimes it doesn't. All that I have is an archive to take away, at least talking for speaking of the documents, or to complete with their own associations and memories. It's an archive constantly being actualized by its visitors. So maybe one could say that our material only functions as a trigger for the one who's perceiving it. We'd like to show a short extract from the third edition of Alles, was ich habe, All That I Have, which was called The General Guide to Anything Anyone Might Have or See Anywhere. And this general guide was a publication to self-edit. And the film, which is a short extract, was one part of the installation and was navigating the viewer from this one exhibition space to the other one, which was at a different place in the town. And actually, can you jump back once? So the bottom right side was the one space, and so there you would watch the film, and then it would navigate you to the other collection, which you can see in the left image, where we just infiltrated our collection in that museum. Yeah.
Interesting here, because we forgot to say it's quite a cut between the Max Planck archive and that one, but we will come back to the Weirdo files.
Oh yeah, I forgot to say.
Just in case you're wondering what's going on.
With the sound, or is
it is connected.
Maybe.
Imagine there's a map of a city. The map marks places in that city, places of different qualities. One is a white space. There's a white space in the city. There's a chair in that white space, and there's a visitor on that chair.
For an easier understanding, the visitor will be in the following only referred to as she. The visitor only recently turned towards the chair. The visitor only recently left her position, reading papers pinned on the wall in a white space.
Now she's sitting. Look at her sitting. Look at her putting her arms on the rest. Look at her crossing her legs. Look at her feeling comfortable. Look at her looking at you.
Now the visitor is not looking at you anymore.
Now the visitor is looking at images.
She's looking at a selection of squared archived papers. The papers belong to All That I Have 3. They belong to groups of squared archived papers, examining public spaces, crossroads of time, and places of hidden knowledge. You can see what the visitor is looking at, now, and now, and now again.
The visitor could also look at other people looking, maybe even without seeing what they are seeing. She could look at people who are looking at something which cannot be seen. Now the visitor is imagining what other visitors could see, what they could wish to see or what they might see while closing their eyes.
She might be looking at places that are not to be accessed, or at places that vanished by mankind or by nature. She could imagine what these places might have looked like, She could imagine to be somewhere else.
But she's not. The visitor is still sitting in a chair. She's looking outside a big window. There's a city outside that big window.
There's a building across the street.
There's a huge door in that building. A visitor in a chair is staring at that door. She's staring at it now.
Or she's imagining staring at it. She's thinking of that door as a sheer possibility to exit or to enter. Maybe there's another visitor behind that door, meditating on the sheer possibility to exit or to enter. Both of their looks could meet for the fraction of a second, or not at all.
Are you still sitting in that chair?
Are you still listening to our voices while looking at the selection of squared archived papers?
Are there other visitors surrounding you? Did they recently leave the chair you are sitting in right now?
Did they recently approach the back room of the white space?
Yes, and then it would lead you to this other exhibition. Yes. So after working with those strategies of archiving, we were wondering or interested in the place of where the archive could be situated, and that would of course be an institution. So this was maybe the next step to give you a bridge.
Thank you. So we started to work with a quite broad definition of institution, which would mean, on the one hand, just a set of rules, for example, to enable the life and work of any society, up to huge organizational and architectural narratives like theaters, as we are not coming from, but are somehow referring to. And the temporal institution, which was happening as a durational performance in the project space of Akademie Solitude, was toying with those definitions I just said, and invented strategies to redefine it from day to day. So it lasted for 11 days, 6 hours per day, with more than 50 directly involved participants, maybe 30 guests who came again and again, and up to 250 one-time visitors. The institution was a place of collective activity based on principles of hospitality, with its own archive, and that's the bridge I'm jumping on, with its own archive, which was all that I have. The institution had also the meeting, work at a dinner table, an indoor garden, and a guest room. The archive, all that I have, and the preliminary research which led to it, was inserted as a prompter for narrative motives, sets of rules, or simply the archived and fictive knowledge of that as fictive institution. It became the starting point on the fragmented script for the architecture. What we did is just we built with the stage designers we work with quite a lot. We built a second structure in that existing architectural structure, which was based on some stories and documents from our archive, which was slightly shifted and imaginary continuing outside of the existing real architecture. Our archive became also the starting point for games. Two performers who were all the time present in the institution played a set of rules we invented based on the archive, a set of rules, and those two performers were constantly playing, and while playing, of course, actualizing and interpreting those rules in different ways. It was quite simple tasks. They were just doing and doing again, from sitting in a corner and reading to standing, as you see it on the right side, like postures and gestures and everyday activities which actually everybody else who was entering the institution was also doing, like visitors, and they had that a set which they were constantly playing with. The archive became also the narrative fundament for a time structure, and based on the archive also actualization through other visitors on the left side. For example, there is one member of a group of non-professional musicians living next to the Römerstraße, and they were entering from time to time the spaces and were interpreting one 11-day long score by a composer, and this score consisted of sometimes only one tone per hour, and the other time they were just there. They came for 3 hours and played 3 tones, and the rest of the time they were just visitors and waiting for something to happen. And the last structural level, the archive was used in probably the most conventional way for, was a theatrical tour through the institution, which was starting, as you can see on the left, in that room where the woman is sitting in, starting there with a video, and then the one guest was taken by taken by one performer, and he guided the guest to another space, and then he became headphones to continue his way, and then he or she was meeting the performers again in the archive, and it was a kind of a performative tour with different media lasting for 45 minutes and guiding always one visitor at a time through the institution in a theatrical way. And I will start a few images and continue talking, because there are a lot of silent passages. So on the left side here, there's that huge table which during the time it was used as a dinner table where neighbors were invited and just repeated to come and to come and to come. In the beginning there was already no one, and at the last days the place was always very crowded. People who really came from the neighborhood, and also people we invited from other places, and the table became also the place for workshops and for workshops, and for example one class of the Academy of Fine Arts, they had their seminar there, so the table was really like the center for very different uses. Those are some of the musicians. The light you can see as it's changing is signifying repetitive time structure. And through all those more theatrical things like that, time structure, and also the guided tours through the spaces, and moments when you had headphones and you were looking down on the table, what was happening down there. All those theatrical elements created perspective on anything else which was happening, which is distancing oneself from the things which were actually happening, like which could be a dinner or a workshop. And in this way, everything became also criticizable. So with those elements of theater, we enabled the single visitors to step aside and let everything else just go on and observe it with a different perspective, which was able to criticize and observe what was going on. And in conclusion, there were one of the main thoughts that thing was following was that we tried to have as many people in one space as possible with different reasons why they are there. So it was easily possible that there's one person who has booked a theater tour. There are 20 others who came for a seminar of the Academy of Fine Arts, and there were others entering the space waiting for the dinner to start. And we tried to make those people not meet in a way that they start to talk and to meet, but in a way that the place was used from different perspectives, and everybody was observing everybody else. And that is actually the seminar. And as I guess now it's only 5 minutes left, I will maybe jump to the moment when the archive, all that I have, and the institution come together again with the Max Planck Society's documents. As Melanie said in the very beginning, we are working on a series of single pieces or scenic test arrangements, like the apparatus, the archive, the audience, the garden, the home, the institutions. We just had the opening of Parliament, and so on and so on and so on. And all those single projects in that series are toying with the structures of narratives or institutionalized narratives or institutions in that broad definitions I just said. And one which could come in the next, maybe in the next year, could be the society. That's a working title. And the society would use those unrealized plans for research institutes and the weirdo files of the Max Planck Society's archive, together with fictive follow-ups of them, and as well as an actual research group. We would like to start with those elements found in the Society of the Max Planck Institute and create a net of audio stations, performative scores, and spatial installations in different institutes of the Max Planck Society, just to initiate on that level something which was before that left out and rejected in those weirdo files. I'm losing myself a little because I'm trying to win time, but as I realize now, as far as I'm leaving the script behind, I'm even losing more time. So maybe so there is a project based on the, it's a dilemma. Okay. So then maybe I read the proper conclusion and read it in 3 minutes. So the catalogue of performative practices, and those are examples, and we just presented 2 examples, collects scenic test arrangements in which we are toying with machineries of knowledge and narration, like archives, theaters, universities, and so on, plus the tools they use, like indexes, dramatic texts, seminars, and so on. And the entries of the catalogue do not claim to invent new or better concepts of those institutions. In the temporality of performative interventions, the possibility of alternative structures might appear, realized, and constantly actualized through the fugitive presence of visitors and guests. And that was what we were trying to show. And, but the dilemma was even going on because while reading the conclusion, I realized that part of it I already said before. I guess, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Any questions? So I'm trying to get more time. No, but maybe can you a little bit more explain what is your interest, especially in this? I mean, the context why you're getting confronted with these files is clear, but because there could be many approaches on this. I mean, I this kind of image of the genius, which is insane. I mean, all these narratives that come to my mind, but there can be many approaches, so I would be very curious.
I can start and say, I don't know, it's really, we're in the middle of realizing what's interesting for us in that, those materials, and I guess we would answer also differently. For me, what is interesting is really this question of what would have happened if. It's because there is this entire folders and masses of material of people who had ideas, but who didn't have the chance or who didn't get the opportunity to be instituted. And for me, that is like the one that I find most intriguing in also in relations to the other works we did, where it's always about this other possibility or the acknowledgements of other possibilities that could have also been taken. But you would maybe say something else.
I think we simply did not decide yet. There, as you said, many interesting things. And for me, at this moment, while reviewing the material for that, or parts of the material for that presentation, one of the most interesting or intriguing things while reading, but this is an experience of reading, not of conceptualizing, is that especially in those letters which could be easily classified as some of the schizophrenic authors, the interesting thing for me is how really the official history is mirrored. So you read the letter, and you can exactly say when it is. So simple things. There is a time when a lot of people write, do they have to be worried when the television is standing next to the kid's bed because of the, I don't know the word, anything makes it the kid sick. And there's of course the time when a lot of people start to ask or start to fight against Heisenberg. And it was the time when the nuclear research was getting more and more, and the first results were taken, and then they started to write those main figures and try to get in a discussion. And then there was a time when that Stalin thing is, and so you can really take examples of those letters and read it and have two parallel histories. It's the one is the official history with all those main events, and the other one is how it's mirrored in lives which were really not in the public, which were not really present in the public minutes. So, this is really a reading experience, and we have not decided how to.
Maybe you have to shake it also.
Okay, yeah, so there's something which I would like to say, and probably from some other time distance I will just put what I will say to the spinner files. So there was a moment in Ljubljana where I kind of felt there was a highlight. That moment there was when a guy who was running, who's crazy, a spinner, who was running a bookstore in Ljubljana. but couldn't really catch up with all of these challenges of the digital age. But obviously he was doing that because of love for books and not love for businesses. And then a public library was an event where, in a way, it just it was a concentration of his, a dream. Like a lot of people buying books, discussing them, and also celebrating the accessibility. And that celebration was basically killing his last hope that he can survive with the bookstore. And his kind of testimonial was the best thing there, because he was, in that sense, celebrating his business suicide, which is kind of kind of exploitative. Also, when I'm doing that, but in a sense, I don't have a question. Maybe a few later on, but that's how I feel about this moment. And I don't think that every event has a moment of highlight or whatever. It's just like craziness. Maybe I'm just in that mode because of under pressure and all of that. But that's exactly how I kind of see this as a highlight, because in a way it provides the narrative device, which we always need. So we really did a lot of work here to kind of do all of these rules, how it's some kind of a fantasy, how the story would go. We tried so many things. And then I just realized that there is so much more it could be done and it should be done in terms of dramaturgy, and even just like your little talk that's what was happening, but at the same time it was reflecting also how much this kind of built, but also how much it needs more. So it's more like, let's just put this into Spinner files, but thank you very much.
I've got a question and a comment, I guess. The question is how is it today? Has this practice of calling people who are giving in ideas for institute, has this gone on, and are they still calling them Spinnerakten? And the other question is in the course of the Max Planck Society, you were saying they started with 2 institutes, chemistry and physics, which from a certain point sounds very reasonable, and now it's 83, which I just had the idea that how often do you click through, I don't know, some research facility of a university's webpage and you cannot believe that this institute actually exists, because because they are really crazy ideas. So just from my point of view, there are often very small institutes. It's you cannot believe that is there, and how this probably how is it today, and that's my question.
Well, we were only access to the files until the late 70s. Do you remember? Because as long as people are still alive, they haven't yet entered the archive yet. So there is a research group we were invited by the Max Planck Institute for History of Science, and in that Max Planck Institute there is a research group exactly researching the current history of proposals and of rejected proposals, but we didn't get access to that.
It's a very long process. Of course, we had that question also after 2 weeks reading those things. What is the proposal today? And at one point I met one scholar from that research group, Medak just said, and I thought I could ask him and the next day I get the file, but it was not like that. So he started to explain the ways how it could be possible, even if it's not possible to get the files. But for that we would need maybe a year or something, because then you can start. Every director of the Max Planck Society who is dying leaves all his all his letters and all his files for the archive. And you can start to go through those files and search for research institute's proposals, but that would need a lot of time. Or there is actually one committee, of course, right now, which is especially their main goal by to meet is to discuss proposals for research institutes. But for that, I would have loved to take part in that in one of those meetings. But of course, it's not possible. You can come there. I'm interested in rejected research proposals. Can I take part in your meeting, please?
Especially not us. I mean, we were there as artists, which was probably also the only excuse that they invited us. Because it's really this super elite group of scientists, and it's like they keep. I felt that like in those groups, there's also about keeping this distance up. So.
But we're working on it.
Yeah, we're working.
I have one question, because I think it's very well described how this parallel history appearing by reading through these files, and if you immediately put from the one side of the so-called Spinner, get an image of the side of what was going on in science and things like that. This is, I would say, this is a kind of a nearly dialectic relationship of this kind of two layers. But on the other side, then you transferring that in a performative and spectral practice, and you create a discretion again, or a derive, whatever you want to call it, again from this dialectic relationship. How the archive in this moment for you change?
Our archive? The archive.
At least the referential field you're taking.
Yes. It's a tricky question.
No, I guess
Next question.
I can answer with part of that, the conclusion I had at the end, which I said 2 times. But I guess you could call it an excuse. Because I would say that we are not doing the performative installations and those things to change the notion or the structure of existing archives.
I totally agree with this.
So what we are trying to do is to create interfaces where you meet those structures in a different way, and you suddenly realize it in a different way. At the same time, we are dealing with content of that archive. So it's again that mirroring effect, as you said. But of course, it's not changing. It's not at all changing the politics of those societies' archives.
But for me, in one point, I would say it is, because it's like understanding, and I guess this is also the reason why public library is not only, like your public library is not only existing in the internet, but it's also existing in this kind of meeting here. Because we are interested in this archive or the archive also as social places, and I guess this is why it still remains in this performative context where people would come and would meet, and we try to work on this setup. I'm getting a bit distracted. Try to work on this setup of the archive as a social place.
I think the main difference to most of the things I heard in the last days is that it's not about making things public. It's more about creating those performative setups where audiences need different structures in different ways. Maybe to put it that way.
Yeah, thank you for this last sentence, but because it almost answers the question I wanted to put. Having followed your work for the last 6 years, I had the impression that the main question you had in mind was how to reduce theater and theatrality to its essentials, so that it's clear, possible to define what theaters would be made of if you would suppress the actors, the text, and so on. And listening to you today, you were denying your own origin from theater. You said this, Bernard. And I was a little bit afraid. And my question was, did you really change your original purpose regarding what you're doing? Is now this topic of archive in the middle, or is it just because of the conference now?
No, actually, no, I didn't deny the theater reference. I would always, and I'm still doing every time when I meet the dramaturgs of state theaters, I'm still arguing that it is theater and our main reference is theater. What I was denying is because I was referring at that point to the theater as a state's institution. And I was going to say that we are coming from that theater institution, but that's not true because our moments where the huge theater institutions in our work met were just a very few. So I can't say that that work has been developed within the institutional framing of states theaters. That was the thing I was referring to. No, yeah, for me it's still always the question of how can the medium theater be reduced to a minimum where you can easily see without showing it how it could go on. And at the same time, that means, of course, the question to and that's why it's also, for me, part of an institutional critique within performing arts, is that kind of theater as a medium is not possible to be produced and developed in the theater as an institution as they are structured right now.
Well, we can skip the last question to go on.
No.
You have an imaginal question for yourself. No, one more last question. Okay, a little break? No? So she's the hard one. Okay, we're going on in 5 minutes.